Այսօր բանը շատ հետաքրքիր, որտեղ այսօր մենք ունենք շատ հիաշարի մեկը, Laura Michael, որ ուզում է դասխոսություն տա այսօր համար, անունը Finding Home, an Armenian American's Journey to Historic Armenia, անգլերեն լեզվով։ Բայց դրանից առաջ կուզենամ ասեմ Տիկին Շաքել Բարսումյանը, որ ստեղ կա, կուզենամ երկու հատ երգերքի հայոց հովիկը և օտարամահի ջամփեն։ So կուզենամ ասեմ, որ Տիկին Շաքել համեցեք։
Thank you.
Շատ մերսի դիգին շակե, այդ շատ հիաշալի երկեր են, մերսի, որ մեր դասխոսությունը սկսարածանով։ Մնացած դասխոսությունը հիմա անգլեն լեզվով է լինելու, so poker introduction տամ. So the title for today, as mentioned, is Finding Home, an Armenian American's Journey to Historic Armenia by our wonderful Miss Laura Michael. Now, just to give a quick introduction, Laura Michael is an Armenian American activist, educator, and writer who was born and raised in Rhode Island. So we're very glad to have her come to the Los Angeles area about 3 or so years ago. She received a bachelor's degree in Spanish from the University of Rhode Island and a master's degree in education from New York University. Laura has taught at the K-12 education level and also post-secondary levels in Massachusetts and New York, and currently now lives in Los Angeles, where she is an English program coordinator for a local school district. She is a member of the ANCA Western Region Education Committee, whose main goal is to support schools with the implementation of Armenian genocide education curriculum. Laura is also an author and has been a contributor to the Armenian Weekly magazine. Her first children's chapter book about the Armenian genocide, called Under the Light of the Moon, is being published this spring. So with all that in mind, we want to give a warm, nice welcome to Laura Michael for our talk.
Thank you, Tanya, for that lovely introduction, and Deacon Chake for those quite emotional songs, but I think they set the tone for this presentation. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I really want to thank the church's education committee for inviting me to speak. This is the first time I'm doing this presentation on the West Coast. I've given this lecture on the East Coast, and I'm so happy to be able to bring it to Los Angeles, where I live now. So, we know the saying, where there's a will, there's a way. But for me, in taking this trip to historic Armenia, it was more about the why. Why am I taking this trip? And the photos I have up here are my family members who were living in historic Armenia at the time of the genocide. So this first photo, my great-grandfather, his father, his uncles, his cousin, and my great-grandfather on the left is the only one that survived. And then this photo, my great-grandmother in the back row at an orphanage in Aleppo because she lost her entire family. And this photo, actually, you can see many adults in this photo, and I have been circulating this photo around everywhere to scholars, to academics, and various organizations because we don't know the name of the orphanage where my great-grandmother was. We know it was in Halep, but we don't know who these adults are in the photo. And I always think that it would be so wonderful if we knew who these people were and my family could reach out to their descendants and just thank them for basically saving my great-grandmother. They're the reason why I'm here today. And another photo of my great-grandmother with 2 of her friends in the orphanage. So all families have stories and histories when it comes to the Armenian genocide, and I always knew bits and pieces of my family's story of survival, but like many of us, I don't have the full picture. And another photo of my great-grandparents, my grandmother, and her siblings once they arrived in Providence, Rhode Island. So my great-grandparents were genocide survivors, and they somehow made it to Providence in the 1920s. And so my grandparents were born in Providence, my parents born there, and myself as well. And just kind of another connection, so you can see some photos of my grandparents, my great uncle, my great aunt, and an excerpt of an essay that I wrote when I was a middle school student in Rhode Island. And in Rhode Island, we don't have any everyday Armenian schools. We're not fortunate like we are here, where we have so many choices for Armenian children. So I went to a public school. I was the only Armenian in my class. And as a middle school student, I was horrified to learn that none of my classmates knew about the Armenian genocide, because our schools were not teaching anything about it. And when I opened my history textbook, I didn't see anything about it. And that was very frustrating to me. So I wrote an essay when I was in middle school, and the last paragraph, it kind of sort of makes my life come full circle, because I'm an educator now. And I basically wrote here that I did my family's project on the Armenian genocide because I want people to know about it. I want kids to learn about it. And I said that hopefully by the time I have children, the genocide will be a part of everyone's curriculum. And unfortunately, we are still working on that. And that's where the ANC Western Region Education Committee comes in. And I'm so proud of the work that we do there, because we're able to influence school districts and policymakers and make sure that they are teaching accurate history about the Armenian genocide. I will tell you that currently many of the major history textbooks in the United States are still publishing inaccurate information about the Armenian genocide, and that really needs to change. And that's one of the initiatives that we're working on as an education committee. We also take the time every year now to host a luncheon and honor non-Armenian educators who are doing an exemplary job of teaching about the Armenian genocide. And it's really important that we really honor these teachers, because first of all, teachers usually don't get a lot of recognition. And we already know that our Armenian teachers are definitely going to teach about the genocide, but we want to make sure that everyone is teaching about it, and that everyone realizes that the Armenian genocide is not an Armenian issue, it's a human rights issue. It affects everyone. There have been so many other genocides because of the Armenian genocide and the continuous denial of the genocide. And so we need to keep reminding people that this is a global human rights issue, and it's not just an Armenian issue that happened over 100 years ago. So now getting to my trip that I took to historic Armenia, you can see that it says part 1, the lie that I told my mom, because my mom would never want me to step foot in Turkey. It's that's just not something that, my family, would never want to go there, would never want to buy any products that were made in Turkey. It can be a dangerous place for Armenians and ethnic minorities. And so I just knew at this point in my life, though, that I had to take this trip. Something was just pulling me there. And so I told my mom that I was going to present-day Armenia. She thought I was flying to Yerevan. And so it was very challenging to tell my mom that I'm going one place when in fact I'm flying to Istanbul. But I knew in the long run that I would be telling her the truth, and I knew in the long run that she would understand why I needed to do this. And so back to that saying, where there's a will, there's a way. So you can see there's a map up here, and this is a map of one side of my family's ancestral villages, Havav, which is part of Palu. And so the story behind this map is a genocide survivor came to the United States shortly after the genocide, and he wanted to make sure that everyone remembered everything about the village. So he hand drew a map of our village and labeled everyone's house. So I knew I was in a very unique position, because most of us know the villages our families came from, but we can't identify the houses. We don't have a map of everything in the village. And in some cases, you can visit a village and there's no remnant of anything Armenian, which we'll get to. But having this map, I knew that if I went to Havav and I was going with some highly qualified people who have been there before, that we would find my family's homes. So that was a driving force in taking this trip. And speaking of some of those qualified people, I went to Historic Armenia with a group of 10, and you can see a couple of the people here with me. Dr. Khachi Moradian, I'm sure many of you know or are familiar with, who travels to Historic Armenia often, and a genocide scholar. So he's one of the best people to go with if you're interested in going to Historic Armenia. And also Matthew Karanian, who has the Historic Armenia photography book. And he came with us because he's working on his second book. And so he was taking photographs for his book. And this photo is actually, we were hiking up a mountain in Sasun in this photo. So we had to start our journey in Istanbul. Obviously, you have to fly into Istanbul. So we spent a day there, and we had a friend's cousin's wedding to attend at the Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul. And so while we were going there, it was very interesting to me that this church has been there for years, and we had a taxi driver who has been driving the streets of Istanbul for years, and he never knew that the Armenian Patriarchate existed here. So that was kind of shocking to me. Shocking and not so shocking. And this moment where we were actually all singing the Haidmer in the church, and it was meaningful then, but it became much more meaningful after the whole trip, because this is the one functioning church in Turkey that I went to on this whole trip. Every other church that I went to is in ruins. We're not allowed to renovate them. They're in total disrepair and they're being dug up. And so after the trip, just reflecting on this moment, it was very emotional, just thinking about how this was the only time that I was in a functioning Armenian church in Turkey. And while in Istanbul, we were also able to meet with Abdullah Demirbaş, who some of you may be familiar with. He's the former mayor of Diyarbakir, or Dikranagir. And he's been imprisoned many times. And so this was right, you can see him in the front on the left, but this was, he had just gotten out of prison and he came to meet us for tea. But so he is an ethnic Kurd, and he's actually been a staunch supporter of Armenian genocide recognition in Turkey, and specifically when he was mayor of Diyarbakir, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. So we only stayed in Istanbul overnight, and then we were heading east to really go to all of our villages. And we started in Diyarbakir, or Dikranagir. And it's a little hard to see in this photo, but this is something that the former mayor insisted be erected, and it's a welcome sign to Diyarbakir, and there's Armenian on the sign, which is highly unusual in Turkey. But also one of the reasons why he got in trouble. And this is just a photo of a former Armenian quarter in Dikranagir, and now it's totally inhabited by Kurds, and there's barely any remnants of anything Armenian here. However, another initiative by the mayor was to erect an Armenian genocide memorial, a monument, in the city center of Dikranagir. And so another reason why he got in trouble. He also, is he's a Kurd, and it's definitely not a good thing to be a Kurd in Turkey right now. But when he was mayor, he had this genocide monument erected, but he was removed as mayor, imprisoned. He's not even allowed to go back to Dikranagir. And so now people are vandalizing this monument and scraping off the letters. We were also able in Crescenta to climb up the city walls. Crescenta is known for its old city walls. And in this scene, I'm up on top and I'm kind of looking out to the outskirts of the city. And I just remember thinking in this moment about what could have been and what was at one time in this city. And we were very fortunate to be able to climb up here because Diyarbakir is highly militarized right now. And parts of the city are totally closed off, and we weren't even thinking we would be able to climb up on top of the walls, but we were allowed to. But speaking of being closed off, we were not allowed to go anywhere near Süt Giragos Church, which was the renovated Armenian church in Crescenta. We couldn't even see it in the distance. And this was back in June, last June. And then I think it was around August where those photos came out of the destruction of that church and how it's just been pillaged and ruined once again. So that was very frustrating to see. Just some more scenes of Crescenta. So the old bazaar where it used to be totally Armenian shopkeepers and merchants, and now there's no remnant of anything Armenian there. And on the right, you see the Tigris River with a bridge, and I'm actually standing by a beautiful tea house with rugs on the lawn and roses. And it's just this, beautiful scenery. But if you're Armenian, it's incredibly disturbing because this is where they threw Armenians over the bridge into the Tigris River, and now there's this beautiful tea house for people to relax there. But as an Armenian, you definitely cannot relax there. And this is another church in the Armenian quarter of Crescenta, Sarkis. So you can see it's totally in ruins. The roof is missing. The grass is growing inside. And on the right, you can see a man named Hussein and his son Faisal. So Hussein is one of the hidden Armenians or Islamized Armenians of Crescenta. Hussein found out later in life that he had an Armenian grandparent, and he has decided that he is Armenian. He has traveled to Echmiadzin, and he has been baptized in the Armenian church. When Süt Giragos was open, the hidden Armenians of Crescenta were gathering there. They had an Armenian language teacher that was teaching them Armenian. They were learning more about the culture and the history. So Hussein, although he has a Turkish-sounding name, is, in my eyes, he's 100% Armenian. But he's pointing out here, and this was a very common scene, there are holes in the ground in the churches. People are digging because they think that Armenians buried their treasure in the churches before they just left. So the story is that Armenians just decided to voluntarily leave, and for whatever reason, they buried their treasure in the churches before they left, which that doesn't make sense at all. But this was the first time that I saw in person a hole like this in one of our churches. And this is an old Armenian cemetery in Crescenta that is totally in ruins. You can see some of the tombstones have fallen over or been pushed over. There's an apartment building over here that you can't see. And there's a fence along the perimeter. And I saw these people come out to their balcony, and they took their trash and they just dumped it in the cemetery. So there's very little respect for Armenian property, or what was once Armenian property, and some of it is just ignorance and lack of knowledge because they've been told one narrative for 100 years, and some of it is that there is a prejudice against Armenians. This is actually one functioning church and a Syrian church in Crescenta that we were able to visit, and we met the priest there, and he actually brought out the old baptismal records, and it's all in Arabic, but we did find some Armenian names because sometimes Armenians were also baptized in this church, so it was very interesting just to go back over 100 years and see these records still at this church. But probably the most meaningful part of the Crescenta part of the trip was meeting with the group of hidden or Islamized Armenians. So we gathered at a cafe one night, and it was challenging because none of us speak the same language. They all speak Turkish. We had one person in our group who speaks Turkish, so he was kind of the translator going back and forth. But we still were able to connect with them, and I find them incredibly courageous because they're living in a situation every day where it is dangerous to be a Kurd, it's dangerous to be an Armenian, but they are all strongly identifying as Armenians, and most of them found out later in life, like they had a grandmother who was dying and she made a confession to them. So stories like that where they find out as adults that they actually are part Armenian, and they find out that their grandmother was taken by Kurds and was forced to convert. And so these people are the people who were keeping Supgiragos running for a while. And they were traveling to Armenia together to learn more about being Armenian and Armenian identity. And so it was really great to meet with them and get to know them. And one of them is a very talented singer, and she actually started singing in Armenian for us. And I'm going to try to play a clip of her singing just because I want you all to sort of feel like what it was like to be there in that moment and have that experience. So let me see if I can get this to play. At the end of that video, you can hear one of them calling my name and saying, Sasunsi, Sasunsi, and he's trying to tell me that Sasunsis don't cry, because it was very emotional. I started crying, and my response was, well, I'm not Sasunsi. So It was just a beautiful evening with them, and even though we don't speak the same language, I still try to keep in touch with them on social media because they really need to know that that we support them, and that, you know, even though we're not there with them every day, that we believe in what they're doing and identifying as Armenians. So then we continued on in our journey, and we moved on to Sassoon. And this was another church. This was actually a monastery that we visited, a monk in Sassoon on a beautiful mountain. It was a very difficult hike. At times, I was getting very frustrated because it was one of the hardest hikes I've ever done. But in those moments, I kept reminding myself of what our ancestors went through and how they had to walk on terrain like this for miles and miles without food, without water, without proper clothing or shoes, and I kept on going. And often when we were climbing these mountains, at the bottom, there would be Kurds, and they're used to climbing these mountains, and so they would often offer to accompany us, to help us. And really, the reason why they were offering to help us is because they thought that we knew where the treasure was. So it was very frustrating because often we needed their help to know the best route to take up the mountain, but we knew the reasons for wanting to help us were not genuine. And then we moved on to a small village in Bitlis. So we were on this road, this beautiful road lined with birch trees, and then we arrived in this now tiny Kurdish village. And there are so many remnants there that are Armenian, the Khachkars, an old church that's being used as a barn now. And the Khachkars being used as sort of walls to hold up their stoves and their firewood. And they're used to small groups of Armenians coming there because it's known that these Khachkars are there. And so they, you know, when you arrive, they kind of look at you suspicious, like, are they going to try to take something from us? But they let us take the pictures, and then we were on our way. And we, you know, you try to explain to them that these are very sacred to us, and they don't understand, or they don't care to understand. And then we moved on to Mush. So this is the former Armenian quarter of Mush. And you can see there's a new building in the background. And so there were about 10 or 12 of these newer buildings. And my fellow travelers, some of them had been to this village, this exact place, 2 years ago. And they were horrified because when they were there 2 years ago, all of the Armenian homes were still there. Now we came back 2 years later and they were totally knocked down, and these new apartment buildings were erected and no one's living in them. The one house that is still standing is this one, and it's because it's the mayor of Yerevan's family's old home. So he worked something out where that could stay standing. And this is a former church. You can see the red crescent graffiti on the side. And a group of Russian Armenians offered to renovate this church, and they were not allowed to. So inside is an overgrown garden, there's no roof, there's graffiti. And Mush is one of the cities we visited where you really do not want to tell people that you're Armenian. Dikrana, there, you know, there's that small Armenian community there, and they can sort of be vocal. Kharper is another place with a small Armenian community, and they can sort of live as long as they don't bother anyone. But Mush you can't say that you're Armenian. This man talking to Hachi is a hidden Armenian. He's originally from Digran but had to move to Mush for work. And here he is telling Hachi that he doesn't tell anyone that he's Armenian because it's not safe to. So many mosques on this trip that have been converted from Armenian churches into mosques. So this is one. It's very hard to see, but on one of those stones is Armenian writing. And even though Mush is very anti-Armenian, there is a tiny Armenian community there, and they have this social club, but it's never open because they've received multiple bomb threats. So they still, as far as I know now, this is still here, but there's no one ever going there. After Mush, we moved on to Van. And you can see the Van Fortress. This is a place where you can pay an admission to get in. And there's no mention of anything Armenian. There are all of these signs everywhere, but there's nothing about Armenians. But there is a Turkish flag. There is a mosque on the fortress now. And very common to see the Turkish flag everywhere and to see mosques everywhere. There's just, there could be a mosque right there, and then on the other side of this room, there's another one right there, and often they were converted from Armenian structures. Another Vank in Van with another challenging hike, but just so picturesque. And we were climbing and walking for over an hour, and we couldn't see anything in the distance. Before we started climbing, we stopped at a gas station just to make sure that we were in the right area. And I think it was around 2 o'clock, and we were concerned that it would get dark out before we made it to the Vank. And the man at the gas station said, "But why are you worried? You're so early." And we were so confused. Why was he saying we were early? It was already 2 o'clock. He thought we were coming to dig for treasure, and everyone digs for treasure at night. And just another scene of the Vank, and you can see Lake Van in the distance. So it was definitely worth it once we saw it and got there. We also visited some islands. This is Gudut's Island, and you can see all of the seagulls. And so there is still a small remnants of a Vank on this island, and not much else. There are people who take day trips to this island for picnics, but they leave their trash everywhere. They don't take it with them. And so some of us were trying to clean up the island and just pick up all of the trash we saw and take it with us. And on this trip, obviously we had to take a boat, so there was the captain of the boat, and there was another guy with us, and they were confused, like, why are you picking up that dirty trash? And so we were just explaining to them that these are sacred places for us, and everyone should be keeping them clean and holy. And anywhere we went where we saw trash like that, we made a point of telling any Kurds or Turks around us that's why we were doing it. And for some of them, you could actually sort of see like a light bulb go off, like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And for some of them, it just didn't matter. And then, of course, we visited Aktamar. And as soon as we arrived, we were reminded that it is not a church where you can pray. It is a museum, and you pay to get in, and you are not allowed to pray here. Only one day per year they have a badarak. And so we ended up finding a small room off to the side where we could light some candles in secret and say the Haimer. And again, just very eye-opening for me because I've never been in a situation where I have to hide who I am or pray in secret. And you can see that Aktamar is in better condition because the Turkish government makes money off of it. And this is the room where, the secret room where we lit the candles. So after Van, we headed to Kharbert, and this is just a scene of the old city. And most of the buildings are maintained there except for Armenian churches or Armenian homes. If it's something that is not outwardly Armenian, they maintained it. But there is an Armenian cemetery that is still used by the small Armenian community that's still there. You can see the names on these graves, and you can see that people are taking care of the cemetery and go there regularly. The Kharbert fortress, and of course, it has a Turkish flag on it now. Remnants of Sut Kevor Church in Kharbert, so you can see the difference if we go back to the old city and how this is sort of a nondescript building. It's not really Armenian, but then when we look at the destruction of a church, the difference there. So after Kharbert, we were heading close by to Palu, which is where one side of my family is from. And so the village of Havav, that map that I showed you earlier, is part of Palu. So we were getting closer. And this is on top of the old citadel of Palu, and you can see the cathedral, or the monastery, in total disrepair. And, you know, who knows, with weather and people digging, who knows how long this structure will be there. And on the citadel is Mount St. Mesrop. So the legend is this is where Mesrop Mashdots came to this cave and came up with the Armenian alphabet. Some of my fellow travelers. Okay. So I included these photos of a Turkish hammam because I want you to see the difference. And you know, this hammam is, you know, are around the same age as our churches and our buildings, and for whatever reason, a hammam still has a roof, and it's still, I mean, the inside is not great, but it's not dug up, it's not totally falling apart. So I just like to include these photos just to really show that comparison and how frustrating it is to see that in person. And so this again is on top of the citadel, sitting on a cliff and looking down at the Euphrates. And this was very emotional for me and for many Armenians too, because again, this is a place where Armenians were taken and thrown in the river and drowned. And for my family, it's extremely disturbing because one of my great-grandmothers had twin babies, and they were taken and brutally murdered in this river. And then it was finally time to go to Havav. So I've circled two of my family's houses on this map. And so I think I had very qualified people with me to help me make sense of this map and find the houses. And so we made our journey to Havav and just, a scene of the land. And I'm not sure that I can put into words what it's like to be back on your family's land, like the land that my great-grandparents actually walked on and the same soil that they touched. It's my first time in historic Armenia. I've been to present-day Armenia before, and I love going to present-day Armenia, but it was never the same for me because I know that my family is not directly from that land. So just being on this soil was so moving and meaningful. And seeing, what had been told to me, the stories that were told down of what it looked like there. And so we did find some remnants of places where churches or monasteries used to be. Some broken khachkars and some tiny remnants. And something that's distinctive about Havav are the Havav fountains. They're kind of famous, and they were on the map. And so we found one of the fountains that's still intact. And we found remnants of one of the monasteries. And you can see in that photo on the right, the broken khachkar, the monastery just, not taken care of. It was, I did find out it was active until 1915. And just more photos you can kind of see up close on the walls. Remnants of khachkars. And we found the only standing church that's left. And Havav had several churches, maybe 8 to 10 churches in the village. And this is the only one that's left standing. You can see that there's no roof anymore. There's grass and flowers, lots of poppies growing everywhere. But again, such a special moment, even just to find this, because just knowing that this could be where my family celebrated weddings, where we had baptisms, funerals. There was a cemetery behind this church, and unfortunately, the graves have been desecrated. And then we encountered this woman. So we were able to locate one of my family's homes, and this woman was walking into the house. And so Khachik spoke in Turkish to her and tried to explain that my family used to live here, and she was not interested in speaking with us, and she just went into the house. This is the newer part of the house that this family who lives here now had built. And then in the back, we saw a pile of rubble, and we saw part of the old house. And these two men ended up coming out. So they explained to us that their family has been living there for a few generations, and just a month before we visited, the old house was totally standing, and they decided to knock most of it down a month before we got there. So that's when I stood on the dirt road and cried for a minute, but then I knew that there was still so much I could get out of this experience, because part of the house was still there. The yard was still there with the fruit trees, and I wanted to keep talking to this man just to find out more. So we were talking with them for probably 15 minutes, and they finally all of a sudden told us that they had an Armenian grandmother, and she was left behind and married their grandfather and converted to Islam. and she grew up in this house. So I can't even explain the shock that you feel in hearing all of this, because my great-grandfather, who also grew up in this house, did not speak much about what happened there, about any other relatives. It was too painful. And so I didn't know if he had a sister, a cousin, so it was just a lot to take. But they were actually, these men, Mehmet and Sharif, were very welcoming. And they said that, they recognize what happened. They recognize it was a genocide. They know, what happened to their grandmother. And they invited us in. So they were showing me around. They showed me the old well where my family used to get water. And this was really special. So this was an old cherry tree that's been there for hundreds of years. And I was able to climb the cherry tree and actually eat cherries from the same tree that I'm sure my great-grandfather climbed. And this is some of their grandchildren. So they're a very large family that lives there, extended family. They all live together. Okay, and so the next photo. So one of my fellow travelers, Ani, from Detroit, she works with the Armenian DNA Project, which I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with, but when she goes to Turkey, she brings a couple of DNA kits with her, because there are often situations like this where a Turk or a Kurd sort of makes a confession that they're part Armenian. And so we asked them if one of them would be interested in taking the DNA test, just to find out more. And while we were there, it was Ramadan, so he asked, well, will this ruin my Ramadan fast? And we said, nope, it's fine, you'll be fine. And so he agreed to take the DNA test. So this is the DNA test in action. And so since then, this is from my grandmother's side. This would be my grandmother's side. And so my grandmother passed away several years ago, but her brother is still living. And it's best if the oldest generation takes the DNA test. So since then, my great uncle has taken the DNA test, and we don't have the complete results yet, but we do know that this man was not lying, because he has many, many Armenian relatives. Basically, when you take the DNA test, you end up getting a list of all other people who have taken the DNA test, and if they're a match to you. And he has so many Armenian matches at this point, but my great uncle's testing is not totally complete yet, so we don't have the results if there's a direct connection between the two of them. We do know that they have some mutual matches at this point, some mutual relatives. So it's at this point in the trip is when I had to call my mom, because she still thought I was in Yerevan at this point. And so we were staying at a hotel in Kharkiv, and I knew I had to call her, so called her, and my brother was there also. He didn't know I was in Turkey, and I said, you know how I told you I was going on a day trip to Lake Sevan today? Well, I'm actually in Habab. And, my mom's first response was, why? What are you doing there? Who are you with? And so when I started explaining everything that happened, she was also in shock as well. And now my family definitely understands why I took this trip and why I may take this trip again. But I know for certain that none of them will ever come with me. and that's okay. I know that everyone has different feelings about going to Turkey and visiting historic Armenia, and I respect that, and my family respects my wanting to go. So before we left Hagov, we still had one more house to find, which was my maternal great-grandmother's home, her childhood home, before she married my great-grandfather. And it wasn't as exciting. There wasn't an actual house, just the foundation and the steps were still there. So obviously no one was living there, but it was still really special to find where she once was, and as a little girl probably ran up and down these steps. So I kind of already talked about this. So this family is the Sherifoglu family, and like I said, we're still waiting for the full DNA sequence to come back, but there are some sort of connections there, and we do know that he was not lying about having an Armenian relative. So again, back to my other great-grandmother's orphanage photo. So this is from my Sepastatsi side, which we did not get to go to Sepastia on this trip because it was just too far from everything else. And so this is still a mystery for me that I've been still trying to figure out just which orphanage was this and who are these adults in this photo. And it would just be really great to have that information. The only information I do know is that it was definitely Aleppo, and it was sometime before December 1920 because we have the record from Ellis Island that she came to New York in December 1920. And one thing I want to mention last, which was also mentioned by Tade in my introduction, is something that's totally been a passion project for me and a real labor of love. And so, as you know, I work in education, and we have a ton of curriculum for the secondary level, middle school and high school, on the genocide. But we really need more curriculum and more literature that is for a younger audience. And a few years ago, I found out about the work of the American organization Near East Relief and everything that they did for Armenian orphans after the genocide. And I realized that my great-grandmother, who was in an orphanage, benefited from the work of Near East Relief. And so I was just fascinated. I couldn't believe how much money they raised. In today's dollars, they raised $3 billion for Armenian genocide orphans and refugees. And one of the key people involved in that fundraising was an American child. There was an actor, a child actor, who was in Charlie Chaplin movies, Jackie Coogan, and he was very famous during the time of the genocide. And he partnered with Near East Relief and traveled across the United States fundraising for Armenian orphans. And then this child, Jackie Coogan, got on a ship and traveled to one of the orphanages in Athens, Greece, and delivered a bunch of those goods that he had fundraised. And as an educator, I just think it's such a beautiful story of how a child can really make a difference in the world and do something and stand up for what's right. And also, I want to make sure that we have more developmentally appropriate books and curriculum for a younger audience. And so I'm really excited to share with you that my first children's chapter book, that's for around like 7 to 11 years old, is going to be available starting next month. It's been published through Mascot Books. You can subscribe to my website to get further updates about that. We're definitely going to be doing more talks and presentations that sort of integrate the book and my historic Armenia trip. And my illustrator is here as well, who did this beautiful cover on Galuyan. And we already have some presentations lined up at local elementary schools, including public schools, which is really exciting for kids to be reading this in school. And so I'm just really happy to share this with you. I know there are some flyers out by the door with more information about the book if you're interested. And I'll also have a sign-up sheet after the presentation if you want to sign up to be on my email list. And that is all I have for you. I think I spoke enough now, so I would love to hear from some of you if you have any questions about my trip, about the book, anything.
Thank you, Laura. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm sure everyone was moved